I'm George Ingram, and I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings. And at what time in my life knew something about education, but not much anymore. We are here to wrap up the conference with a panel to talk about improving international support for education. We have 4 panelists who are very well experienced and educated in this field. Next to me is Manos Antoninas, who is the acting director of the Global Monitoring Report and is a long-standing education expert with extensive experience in a number of developing countries. To his left is Alice Albright, who is CEO of the Global Partnership for Education. And she came to that job with a broad background in international, both private and nonprofit sectors, and with government, in banking, with Gavi, and with U.S. Export-Import Bank. Desmond Birmingham directs Save the Children's Education Global Initiative. He's been involved in international education for a long time, first as a teacher, later as head of education at DFID. Then he held Alice's position when GPE was known as the Fast Track. Anna French, who last year became head of DFID's education policy team, has a background working in conflict and fragile states in governance and program management, and was a senior advisor on Africa to Prime Minister Gordon Brown. My plan with the panel is to get a conversation going. And I'm going to ask a question to one of the panelists, who will have up to 5 minutes to respond, and then invite the other panelists to weigh in on the same topic. And I will pose a question, a separate question to each of the panelists. And I'm going to start with Manos. This year's Global Monitoring Report highlights the degree to which the international community will miss the target of getting every child in school by 2015. By current trends, only 68 of 122 countries will achieve universal primary enrollment, and very few will achieve universal secondary primary completion. GMR has years of experience in thinking and writing of how the international community can be engaged in accelerating progress, and particularly in reaching hard-to-reach communities. What will it take, both in terms of resources and support activities, to reach these communities?
Thank you, George, and thank you also for using the perhaps less scary statistics from the last Global Monitoring Report. A lot of people have focused more on some of the projections we have made for some of the poorest and most vulnerable children who perhaps will not be able to reach the Education for All goals well into the century. In the case of lower secondary education, even well into the next century. And I think I've been given also a very difficult task, given that the last panel proclaimed that aid is dead. So I'm not going to resurrect it, of course, but let's take a step back and see what there is that we can say. The Global Monitoring Report has, over the years, tried to provide an envelope on a number of figures that we refer to, and they often quoted today a figure of the 26 billion of financing gap originates in a piece of research we did 5 years ago, and which we're seeking to perhaps update this year. And of that actually the original financing gap is 29 billion, of which 3 billion was provided for these countries to achieve basic education by external assistance. So a fairly small amount, one might consider. We have argued that this gap can be filled. We have expected that more than half, of course, is going to come from domestic resources. But if donors were to commit to the pledges they've made in the past, a quarter of that gap could perhaps be filled. And I'll come to that in a minute. And that's not surprising. And it doesn't require a leap of imagination to see why that might be the case. Because, again, as the GMR has shown, because in the last panel it wasn't clear what is actually the amount of contribution that external assistance is making in many countries. Well, we have shown that if we look in low-income countries, there's a surprisingly large number of countries that really depend extensively on external assistance. And this year's report is revisiting the issue by comparing 7 countries using an approach of national education accounts that, again, was discussed on a couple of occasions. And there we demonstrate that there are countries which receive, or of the total expenditure on education, which includes not only government and external assistance, but also what households provide, external assistance accounts for almost a quarter of total spending. That's not insubstantial. That's not dead. It's there. And it helps make sure that children and young people have the opportunities they need. So let's not overlook that. And of course, as a share of budget, is a much higher share. I was referring to the total envelope. So aid is critical for low-income countries. But we know that aid to education is currently on the retreat. As a share of the total allocations, it has fallen from 12 to 11% in the last 2 years. And in addition to that, aid to basic education fell by 6% between 2010 and 2011. Low-income countries have suffered particularly. Of the 36, 19 countries saw the amount of aid to basic education they received fall. And the amount is about $200 million. That's almost 60% of what the Global Partnership for Education provided last year. It's not an insignificant decline. Unfortunately, the outlook is also not very positive. Country programmable aid, one definition, standard definition is being used, is projected to fall overall in 31 out of 36 low-income countries by 2015. And going back to the comparison between 2010 and 2011, 21 donors reduced their aid to basic education in this 2-year period. 24 donors, bilateral or multilateral, reduced their aid to basic education in low-income countries. These are quite stunning figures. So what could we do? Well, the GMR has been arguing, and I think on a number of occasions today it has been mentioned, I think Philippe Douste-Blazy did make a reference, that it is important to set targets. We're all ready and eager to set targets for what national governments should spend. I think the time has come for donors also to set targets, some targets. The GMR makes some suggestions, but at least the donor community can get together and decide on what it does aim to do. The main, though, issue, of course, given the environment, is to see how what donors spend can be spent better. And that was, I think, the main question that was asked. So in order to focus more on the hard-to-reach children, what we note is that donors do not respond with the required attention to the needs for that targeting, neither in their between-country allocations, nor in the allocations within countries. And having lived all these years with these excellent public expenditure reviews that the World Bank has been publishing over the years, one takes a step back and wonders, why are there no aid expenditure reviews that look precisely on how aid is allocated and whether the poorest benefit, in the same way that we expect the governments to spend, to look at this issue very attentively. Of course, the between-country allocation needs to be a bit more nuanced, because we know over the recent years that there have been issues with the way the classifications of countries between low-income and lower-middle income can be misleading. and one needs to take a more careful look. There is another way that external assistance can contribute to this debate, looking a little bit beyond the traditional way of thinking about aid to education. This report, this year's GMR, focuses a lot on domestic resource mobilization and identifies two areas in which donors can help. Aid to helping build the revenue-raising mechanisms of the countries that perhaps has been overlooked and would have major impact on the countries. But also a type of aid that is not perhaps commonly thought of these days, but the government-to-government cooperation, and of course at the global level, of helping countries curb tax evasion and all these resources that are lost due to loops that corporations take advantage of. And with a sincere and genuine collaboration between governments, so many issues could be tackled in that direction. The GMR, to come to an end, always looks favorably at multilateral organizations and the capacity they have compared to bilateral organizations to pool funds, to be perhaps less encumbered by criteria that are not necessarily looking at where the most need is situated. And of course, the technical capacity and the ability to work across sector. But these are issues of coordination that perhaps Alice could perhaps talk about.
I will get to her on that later. Good.
So, thank you very much.
Let me invite the other panelists to follow on, and specifically to focus on the question of the manner in which the international community can be most supportive of reaching those hard-to-reach communities. What are the mechanisms? What are the interventions? What are the support mechanisms that can be most useful? Alice?
That's the right button. Okay. Well, I very much agreed with a lot of what Manos had to say, but particularly in the area of efficiency. It's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, which is, while there certainly is not enough ODA money being deployed to education, and I'll make a couple of points on that in a minute, the money that is there is not being spent very well. And, so I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo last week, and I spent a lot of time with the minister and also visiting a school in a very remote region. And he was telling me that the teachers have to spend a week a month walking from the school to whatever is a village that might be available to get paid. And so they get paid for that week of walking, but they're not teaching for that week of walking. And it's something that he was very troubled by, but talked about not only the absence of a road infrastructure, but the absence of a banking infrastructure, which really resonated with me because I'm a former banker. But it just showed how it was one example of a set of problems. And so I do think that there's some improvements that we can make on the efficiency side. In terms of getting to remote, one thing that he very much was talking about was mobile technology to pay teachers. It would be, in that context, it would be a game changer because it would get around the banking infrastructure problem, which is not going to get solved quickly. And it might get those teachers to school for a week more a month, and it would really have, I think, an important impact on learning outcomes. So that's just one example. But I do think that we need to help our countries work on the efficiency piece in addition to how much money is being deployed.
Thank you. Desmond, what is SAVE doing out in the field to reach these communities?
Well, one of the key things we've been doing is looking at domestic expenditure. We've spent most of the morning talking about domestic expenditure for education. Of course, as we know, that is the lion's share, and it will grow. And I think for an organization like Save the Children, our view is that increasingly our role is going to be targeting our advocacy at the country level to empower our partners to advocate to their own governments for the better spending of their taxpayers' money on education and other basic services. I think the role of the international community in that, and perhaps this is a challenge to pass back to Alice and the other members of the GPE board, is to pick up what the GMR has asked for, is really deliver on that mutual accountability commitment, the deal for the deal idea. And coming up to the replenishment, say to donors, we would like you to commit funds to the GPE fund and finance the 4 billion ask. We'd also like to hear your commitment to continue to increase your bilateral financing for education, because that's going to be bigger than the GPE fund, we hope. And we want to hear how you are going to account to the other partners in the Global Partnership for Education for delivery on both. Now, I know from my own past experience that's a big ask and it's hard to do, but I think we're right at the tipping point now where we can make that happen, and GPE is fantastically well placed to make that happen. The other side of the deal is back to the developing country governments to say, and we want to hear from you year on year, not just about your education budgets, but about your education expenditure, and address that issue that Lisbeth referred to this morning that we're all struggling with, to get good data on education expenditure broken down by region, district, quintile of income of the recipients. 5 years ago, we did not have the technology to do that practically. Now we do. UNICEF has done some fantastic work in UNICEF where there is an SMS-based data collection system for every single primary school in that country that gives real-time data on school enrollment, teachers in the classroom, and money spent. The technology is there. You don't even need to have a smartphone. You need a mobile phone. So that excuse is no longer valid. So I think we're at a tipping point now, and the replenishment would be fantastic if we came out of that replenishment with real mutual accountability on both sides of the table. This is the money we're committing, this is how we're going to report on it, and this is how we're going to make sure it reaches the poorest and the most marginalized children in this country. That would be my challenge to many people in this room, actually.
Anna?
So last but not least, I think I just want to make 3 points on this particular issue. I think the first thing is that the point that Manos made about the sort of domestic resource mobilization. I mean, that's absolutely critical, but it's not just about domestic resource mobilization around education. This is looking at the whole system. It's looking about how governments allocate their budgets. So for DFID, we're really focusing on that sort of domestic budgeting and how those resources are allocated, and really making sure that governments are getting best value for money be it through procurement or other kinds of issues. I think the second thing I wanted to say is about looking at assessing the efficiency of school systems and resources and making sure they're well spent and represent really good value for money. I think that's absolutely essential. And we need to create incentives to improve access and learning through kind of innovative finance mechanisms, such as results-based financing. I think that, again, for me, is key. So the final thing I wanted to say is we heard a lot this morning about the kind of political will that's necessary behind getting governments to really support this issue. So how can we as donors help incentivize that political will? What we saw in Australia, and we heard from Australia this morning, we heard from Poland, we also heard from the Brazilian context, really incentivizing governments to think about that, as donors, really putting that pressure on. And that is where we can get systemic change.
Alice, Manos anticipated what I want you to talk to us about, and that is donor coordination. We all know that the education sector is highly fragmented, and it's very difficult to get donors to work together, to work with folks in the private sector, with governments. The Global Partnership has a mandate for coordination. I've always felt that those country education plans and the donor collaboration together with the government were potentially a real mechanism for coordination. I also thought that the Global Partnership potentially could play a role in coordinating with the private sector and what they're doing in education. But talk to us a little bit about the barriers and where you see this headed and what the partnership's trying to do.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So I very much agree with you. It's an issue. I mean, Manos talked a little bit about what's going on in the ODA world, so I won't go into detail, but just to reframe it, ODA is down, and ODA for education is down even more. And also funding in the humanitarian space for education is tiny. It's 1.4% of humanitarian spending, down from a high of 2.2% more recently. So none of those numbers are sufficient, and I won't repeat them. Coordination is, as I think, is absolutely central to the problem. And when you look at it, it's really got a number of pieces to it. And I've now traveled to a number of countries and I've talked to a number of donors. The problem that I see is that donors, with all due respect to them, are all doing, in some ways, slightly different things at the country level. And that causes a number of problems. First of all, when you overlay that against the fact that money's going down, it causes real ebbs and flows of availability of funding to countries. And so what you see is the advent of donor darlings and, in some cases, donor orphans. And there's a number of countries that we're working in that we would put in, certainly in the donor orphan category. We also see that number of donors are pursuing lots of different projects, but they're not necessarily marching in the same direction. And so it causes real transactions costs in terms of monies that aren't being used sort of in a way that's marching towards one set of policy goals. It also causes a lot of time and effort wasted in reporting. When governments have to do, multiple of reports to all of their donors every year, they're taking effort away from what they ought to be doing sort of as their day job, which is promoting better education. So we see this whole issue of coordination as being absolutely central. So what do we do about it? You're absolutely right. It is part of GPE's mandate to fix that. We spend a lot of time at countries getting everyone around a table to endorse a single education sector plan. And when I say endorse, I don't just mean sign it. I mean actually align your funding to a single plan. We are about to present to our board on Wednesday a new funding plan that is really going to give teeth to this concept of what do we mean by a single plan, because I won't go through all the details here, but basically it sets a number of steps out that gets all the donors moving in one direction, funding the same types of initiatives, and also, and this is something that you also spoke about, it has specific provisions to get letters of intent-based commitments from both the domestic governments as well as from the international community to fund a single plan. So what I'm very excited about is we're beginning to put in place, if our board approves it, and I'm confident that they will, actually a mechanism that helps us use the money better and improve coordination. So I'm very excited about it.
Desmond, you have a little bit of experience with trying to get donors to work together.
Are we on the right track, Desmond?
Yeah, I think we've all spent too many of those meetings here herding cats, I think is a transferable skill that I've inherited over many years. I think coordination is important. It's interesting, though, I mean, when you come to an organization like Save the Children, you obviously see things from a very different perspective. And I suppose what I've observed in Save the Children is that when you bring, for example, voices of children to those kind of conversations, it changes the dynamic. It really does. And suddenly all those sort of reasons why we can't work together, why we can't coordinate, why we can't possibly do this within 18 months become irrelevant if there's a group of articulate young teenagers sitting in front of you as a group of donors or a government minister saying, well, why not? And so I would say let's bring an extra dimension to that coordination, and let's bring a bit of challenge from the people we claim to be helping. And, again, we've experienced, all of us, when you put those young people in a room, they're very able to speak for themselves. And it's much harder to answer them, I'm sorry, but you can't have an education for another 5 years because we've got to work out our education sector plans and get them aligned behind us. Try that one.
Anna, DFID is a real leader in education. Are there examples of DFID coordinating with other donors?
No.
Not to put you on the spot.
Yes. So, I mean, DFID is signed up to the Paris Principles for working, and coordination is a central part of that. Do we practice exactly what we preach? I hope so, but I'm sure people in this room will be able to find examples where they may have concerns about how DFID is operating. But I think you have to remember that, we are a donor and we are accountable to the British public, and we're accountable to our ministers. And ministers want results now. And sometimes, that means that, we're driven by different kinds of pressures that mean that we have to to maybe support things in a slightly different way. So I think, sometimes there is an element of reality that we have to bring to that kind of coordination. And then the other thing is that, DFID would like to be always supporting, so budget support if we could be. But I think, our ministers have had our fingers burnt in terms of that financing model. There's been examples of corruption and things like that, which makes us withdraw some of that element of support. So I think we have to remember that, while we support the principles, sometimes the reality in practice can be more difficult.
Manos, the monitoring report sits there and looks over all of this. Give us your thoughts.
I think the monitoring report has not been very kind to GP in the past, has been quite critical, but I think you've probably noticed that this year we have been noticing the great changes that are taking place and the extent to which GP is, of course, now accounting for a much larger share of the external assistance in some countries, although the biggest success are still in small countries. But it's on the right track. Wearing another hat, having been part of the FDI midterm evaluation team, I have to say that I'm really looking forward to this funding plan because it is exactly what seems to be needed most, is the mandate of GPE that should break the ebb and flow that you described, that precisely the FDI was originally designed in order to make sure that there is continuity and predictability. So hopefully such a funding plan will break the ebb and flow. And let's also not forget that the original mandate of the FDI was to catalyze the funds from all sources. And hopefully we'll now have the right mechanism to monitor that we are at last on the right track.
Desmond, SAVE cares about children, particularly disadvantaged children. Half of the 57 million children out of school are in fragile conflict situations. That's a higher proportion than 5 or 6 years ago. How do we reach those children? How do we get education or some level of knowledge to those children?
I mean, the short answer, if we stay where we are now, with less than 2% of humanitarian aid going to education, we're not going to. And so we are saying to the 400,000 children who have fled the crisis to Lebanon, sorry, not only have you lost your homes, you've also got no chance of education. And we're saying to the children, the countless children, we literally don't know how many there are in Central African Republic in the same situation. So I think it hasn't been mentioned enough in this meeting, I don't think. I mean, there's been a sort of unreality for me about some of these discussions because of the strong focus of organizations like SAVE and CARE and World Vision and many others in this room who work in those contexts where it's a life and death question. And where it's a life and death question for those children, where they get into somewhere that isn't just about education, it's about somewhere safe, somewhere protected, and somewhere that gives them a place to recover from the trauma that they've experienced. And yet, we still encounter in SAVE, and I'm sure other organizations have the same, a bizarre dialogue with some donors who say, we don't include education in our humanitarian response because it's not life-saving. Well, tell that to the children. Tell it to the parents, because that's what they tell us they want. Yes, they want water. Yes, they want somewhere safe and away from the conflict, but they also want, as a parent, of course we all would, to get their child into somewhere that looks a bit normal. And an education space looks relatively normal. So I think we have got to do something about that, and we've got to do something about that now. I've been delighted by the moves of GPE to try and respond more flexibly to education and emergencies and education and conflict situations, and I really hope that that moves ahead. That's essential. I really hope that all donors, DFID included, and the EU in particular, make sure that they do deliver on policy commitments which are including education in humanitarian responses. We're not seeing that happening on the ground in every country yet. And that we find ways of making sure those children, like any other child, enjoy their right to education. It's a scandal, frankly, that we are still having this debate years after the UN General Assembly has said every child has a right to education. And every child means every child.
Desmond, just to pick up on what you said, I think it was 15 years ago that I first was made familiar with the arguments of why education was such an opportunity in humanitarian situations. It sounds like we haven't gotten anywhere in 15 years.
I would say we've made some progress in some places, and we did have the European Union ECHO humanitarian organization giving its Nobel Prize money that it won as peacekeeping to education programs. And that was a massive step forward, because previously ECHO, which is one of the biggest humanitarian funders, had said, no, we don't do education, talk to the development arm. So we've seen some progress. But you're still encountering on the ground this crazy gap between humanitarian and development, which Anna will know very well from her own personal experience. Literally, in many development organizations, those two arms don't talk to each other. And when they do talk to each other, they talk different languages. Now, we have got to get over that. And we've got to get to a point where actually a child is a child. And wherever they are, they have certain things we should be delivering to them. And I think the role of organizations like SAVE, as I see it, and many of our partners in this room, is to keep on making very loud noises about this if it doesn't happen. And keep on saying, and bring the voices to the children and the parents to this conversation. Because it cannot be, and this is not going to go away. I mean, we're in a very positive position in many ways, looking forward the next 10 years for a lot of low-income countries who will exit their low-income status, become middle-income, be able to fund education systems on their own. We are still going to have a rump of conflict-affected and fragile states and emergency situations around the world. And those countries are going to be, in my view, where aid should be most used and where it's going to have the biggest impact. And that's the argument we can win with the taxpayers in donor countries. You know, in my own country, in the UK, there is criticism of the development budget, but nobody's challenging the need to help children affected by war or help children affected by floods. So there is a political economy there that we can win if we really get serious about this and deliver.
Anna, how does DFID approach these populations, and is there any hope that the conversation and work that's going around resilience is helping to break down this gulf between the humanitarian side and the development side, so maybe there will be more attention to education?
Well, look, I mean, Desmond's right. You know, the humanitarians and the people that call themselves development specialists, we don't speak effectively to each other. We don't have that same language, exactly as Desmond says. And, you know, only on Friday I was talking to the team working on Syria, and they were saying, you know, we've got a limited budget. And the humanitarians were saying, you know, why shouldn't we just be giving this to sort of immediate life-saving responses? So it's a hard one to argue. But, you know, we've got some small wins and some small successes. You know, there are multi-year programming now for a humanitarian response. That's important for issues like education. But, I mean, I think if you sort of broaden it out and look at fragile and conflict-affected states, you know, in a slightly more broader category, not just the immediate way we've got an immediate humanitarian disaster, again, we have to think about we're not just pouring money into a black hole, you know, and we were doing this in DRC as DFID. You know, we had a huge education program in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And, you know, ministers were saying to us, well, why do you keep, you know, why are we keeping funding to such a high level, the education program, when, you know, how is this going to be sustainable in the future? So I think that what's interesting there is that we've taken a bit more of a step back and started to do some really in-depth analysis from a peace building and state building approach, and really looked at the issues much more holistically. So looking at how states can develop core state functions, looking at the political settlement overall, and helping governments respond to public expectations, and really building that into the sort of programmings, the basic services programmings, and making sure that we've acknowledged that we're contributing to that aspect. So it's not just about, you know, immediate education response and getting children into school. It's addressing that whole system that's absolutely critical.
Manos?
I just want to add one small dimension to the statistic that Alice mentioned, that only 1.4% of all appeals are actually covered in humanitarian aid with respect to education. And it's that this statistic is in fact composed of two parts. One is the very low percentage that actually go as appeals in the first place, target to education. But given that very low amount, education actually has the least absorptive capacity. Only a quarter of what is offered is actually eventually spent, and that's what leads to this very disappointing result. And let us not forget that it's also hardly ever really targeted to quality. So maybe doesn't even achieve what Desmond was saying, which is to create an normal atmosphere for children to feel that the life goes on.
Alice?
Thank you. You're all pointing out sort of absolutely a huge problem that we face. Let me just make a couple comments about how we're looking at it. First of all, I was in Toronto a few weeks ago, and I spent some time with Joe, I can't remember her name, but the woman who is from UNICEF Canada, who is Lebanese and was in Beirut, and spent the evening talking about her experiences. Okay. Well, she's kind of remarkable. She spent about 20 minutes telling a room that was wrapped about how during the war there her family thought about school and how they would do anything to dodge the snipers to get to school because it was their place of normalcy. So it just sort of was incredible. And we've all traveled, but certainly when you go to a lot of these countries, you see immediately the role that education can play. We've got huge challenges here, but I think there is one slight bit of positivism, which is that at least the donor governments that I've talked to are beginning to really see this as a problem and see it not only as a problem in what I would call the education silo, and I don't like to think about education as a silo, but some people do, but they're beginning to see it as a real foreign policy issue and something that if we start putting some real thought to can really begin to have a positive effect in terms of nation building. So I think that's actually a positive. I think what we need to do is figure out the money and the tools. And I'd make a couple of thoughts there. In terms of tools, and this is something that GPE does now, and we're building on this, is in a fragile or conflict or emergency situation, and they're very similar. What do? You need to go in and actually develop a plan that will allow whatever authorities happen to be there, and that's a big question because in a lot of countries that's a hard question to answer, to allow education to continue. But you need to bring everyone around the table and get a plan and then start figuring out how you can rebuild schools and rehire teachers and things like that. That's something that we do now. About 40% of our work are in fragile and conflict affected states, so we do that. We also need what I would call special funding mechanisms. One of the things that I've started thinking about in my time at GPE so far is that our budget cycle and funding cycle is very long, 3 years, 4 years. Monies go out in a very heavily planned way, careful way, et cetera, which has all got merit behind it. But when you are in an emergency situation, we have to spend money quickly. Right now, we are be able to deploy money quickly. Right now, we are able to do so to a limited extent. I wonder if what we need, and this is something that we'll start looking at, is a bigger type of mechanism, almost like a revolving fund type of thing that would allow us to step in more firmly with funding to emergency situations, because I think it's the inability to act quickly enough that is often the problem. So I think we need to start, certainly recognize the huge problem. We're not going to make any progress at all on the 57 million children unless we figure out this problem. But step back and say, what are the tools, and start really chipping away at those. So we did do some initial work, also very closely with our friends at UNICEF and others, looking at the Syria-Lebanon situation. We're going to expand that and present to our board in June what we call a framework for doing work in emergency. We've got to figure out the exact right terminology, but emergency humanitarian situations. So we'll see. I think our board it's hard to know. Some people on our board are quite mixed about this. Others are quite laid forward about it, but we'll see what the situation is. It seems to me absolutely, though, having studied it a little bit, that there is a gap between the humanitarian/emergency world and the developing world, and funding is gapped as well. And the cause of the result of that is that we do have a gap at the country level, and we need to figure out how to get around that.
Thank you for that further explanation, Alice. That was very helpful. Anna, DFID is known for focusing on results. It has a special focus on Africa. The Global Monitoring Report has told us that there's a lag in Africa, not just a lag, but actually a decline in retention in recent years. Is Africa just really hard? Are we focusing on the wrong results? What lessons has DFID learned in this area?
It's a great set of questions, and it's one that my ministers ask me a lot. Look, I think the first thing I wanted to say is that it's really important that we advocate effectively on what the issues are. And so for us, we need to also be able to celebrate some of the successes. It's not all just about saying the situation is so awful, we're in such crisis. So celebrating some of the successes is key for our ministers' engagement in this. About the numbers of children that have fallen, but it's fallen going to school, we've seen huge increases in enrollment. So I think that's the first thing, is that we need to get some of that advocacy right, and I'm not sure we're there at the moment. Second thing that we've learned as DFID is that it's all about the context. The global response is one thing, but it comes down to the country, to the regional, to the district level that's really important, and that really helps sort of our focus on equity. So we need to know where the children are that we need to get into school. We need to know what the barriers are that are preventing them from accessing education and then from learning. And I think that we're investing a huge amount of our own resources in getting that contextual analysis. And then this is leading us to diversifying the kind of education response that we're having. So we're working with a variety of partners. We're working with both state, the non-state, and the private actors to achieve results. This is really important. The second thing I wanted to say is that there isn't just there is some independence, and there can be independence between access and quality. It's not a trade-off. So in some countries, we have learned that you can increase access and you can also increase the quality of education, but we need to know why. And we need to analyse that system as a whole. And we then need to work in our response with the governments, with schools, with teachers and communities to address those issues. And then we can start to see some of the results that we've been striving for. But, ministers, again, focused on results, and some of these investments that we need to make are long-term. They're long-term ones are the ones that are going to be transformative. So we need to be telling our politicians that addressing governance issues and institutions is absolutely critical for the success of the education system in the future. This will bring about the institutional change. The final thing I wanted to say is that for DFID, we're placing learning at the centre of everything that we do. So, our commitments to our public is that we're committed to supporting 11 million children to learn, and that's critical. And we need good data. We need to be able to measure that. And that's what's really going to make the difference in terms of what our response should be. And it's a really, really powerful tool for change and reform. So I think, we're investing a huge amount of our resources in terms of investing in the GMR, in UIS systems, and investing some time into the Learning Metrics Task Force, because we see this as absolutely a critical part to drive our response. And this is going to help shape the sort of future response post-2015. So that remains our real priority for now.
Thank you. Manos, how does GMR, what's your research told you about how to move results?
How to move?
How to get results?
You mean the Holy Grail question?
That's right. That's right. Just a small question.
Well, I guess linking that to the external assistance question, the aid question, I think the important thing is to have a clear focus of what the agency wants to do. One of the parameters that we have focused repeatedly on our criticism of external assistance programs, for example, and that does not really reflect on DFID because that's not the case for the UK, is that 25% of global education aid is actually scholarships and what we call student imputed costs. That's $3.2 billion in 2011. That's 1.5 times what was spent on basic education in low-income countries. Agencies that have clear targets of what they want to achieve clearly should not prioritize scholarships and such costs that actually stay in country more than they prioritize aid for the poorest countries and the poorest people. So that will take us to better results if the agencies have clear targets and put the money where it should go. But I think just to agree, a clear focus on inequality is what needs to take place beyond 2015. That's what the GMR has invested a lot of effort trying to show how unequal is not only the current situation, but also how inequality has actually not decreased, but increased over the last 10 to 15 years, and that's a major disappointment. Improving our monitoring tools, I think we have already a lot of tools in our disposal to do that and demonstrate that, would help shift the agenda towards better results. And of course, we agree on the agenda on learning. Notwithstanding criticism that was voiced in the morning that there are risks with narrowing the curriculum, but actually bringing the issue on the table in many countries has not been easy so far. So a focus on learning will mobilize resources that will help make everybody's contribution beyond 2015 much more effective than it has been so far.
Alice?
I'm just writing a list.
And you come to this with a very much a private sector driven focus on results. And
Well, yes, I do. And I've still spent most of my career in the private sector. I think first of all, it's not a simple answer. I mean, it's a very, very complicated answer. And one of the things that I think distinguishes the education space from the health space, where I worked before I was in the government, is that education is the delivery of a local service. And it's very local, and it's not, in our case, 60 locations. It's almost an infinite number when you think about states and villages and provinces and things like that. And so it's a very different type of challenge than exists in some of the global health initiatives, all of which are very successful, and we can learn a lot from them. But in the one that I know, which does a super job, it's Gavi, they are in charge of delivering a global good, accelerating the availability of a global good, and then delivering a global good. It's not delivering a local service. So this is a very different type of problem. So we need a number of things, I think, in the education space. First of all, we need more money. We've talked about that. We need to spend the money better. I think that we need to understand that the challenge here is not only what I would call a pedagogical challenge. When I got to GPE, I learned a lot about what are the good ways to learn how to read. That's important, but what we need is much better systems management. Do we have the data? When I got to GPE, I realized there's a lot of data on how many children are in school or not in school, and are they progressing to certain levels of school. I didn't see a lot of information about what are they learning and what are the results. So we need to invest in data, and that's one thing that GPE has set itself to committing to, working with UIS and UNESCO and some of the others. We need a much better sense that we have to manage school systems well. And how do we promote that? It's not just data, but it's encouraging teachers to be there. It's paying them properly. It's giving them the materials that they want. It's distribution issues about the materials that they want. So it's things like that. There's assessment. I think we need to get assessment sort of out into the debate and the dialogue. I understand that it's an issue that's possibly controversial because it could be considered, sort of a way of criticizing teachers. I heard an impassioned speech by somebody from the, I believe it's the NEA here, about, teachers were the founders of assessment. They shouldn't be afraid of assessment. I think we need to build on that and figure out a way to make assessment as a tool that empowers teachers to figure out what's going on in the rows of kids out there, rather than framing it as a way to criticize teachers. And of course, we'll have to figure out how we invest and create assessment systems. In terms of the private sector, this is another topic that I think has tended to be taboo. I have a phrase in the office that I say, no taboo topics, so let's bring it on. I think we need to think about it in a much more nuanced way. So far, I think there's some people who get very nervous about private sector because they think it's code for we're going to bring in low-cost private schools to just sort of take over everything. I think we need to be much more sophisticated about it than that, and I would put it into a bucket with three different pieces. One is the private sector are huge stakeholders in good outcomes, so we need them on our side to help us advocate. The second thing is that the private sector, in some circumstances, I think can be part of the solution in improving management outcomes. And we ought to be prepared to bring the private sector, along with other players, into the room so that governments, if they feel like, and again, we have to make sure that governments are in the driver's seat. If governments would like to avail themselves of private sector solutions to improve the management of their education systems, they should be allowed to do that, following their own procurement systems and so forth. We shouldn't be afraid of that. I often get asked about low-cost private schools, and I would reframe that and talk about non-government schools. I've been in 2 countries recently where the governments have undertaken an active effort to bring in now 3 actually, that I just counted wrong, 3 of them, where the government has brought in non-governmental schools to help them with capacity issues. In 2 cases it was church schools, and in 1 case it was an NGO, BRAC. And the government said, we have capacity issues. There are schools that are being made available by these other players. We're going to do 2 things. We're going to make sure that they have some financing so that they can be sustainable and continue to exist. We're going to make sure they follow our curriculum, and we're going to regulate them so that there aren't bad things going on. And that was a deal that they did with these other providers in a way that they could avail themselves of the capacity, but also assure themselves that things weren't going to sort of move in a direction that they're uncomfortable about. I think we need to empower governments to make those solutions, to make those decisions, and get beyond sort of this fear that when we talk about private schools, that it's all of a sudden highly for-profit schools. I think there's a model that exists in this country that I think one ought to look at, which is schools in this country are nonprofit, so they can't make a lot of money. They have to be break-even by definition. And it makes me wonder in other countries that if there are players that would like to create those types of schools in a way that they're accredited, they have the proper curriculum, they're regulated, they aren't going to be sort of abusive from a P&L perspective. I think that if a government would like to avail themselves of that solution, we should figure out how we make that work without necessarily getting afraid of it. So that's just sort of my thoughts on it, but I come away with a sense of how huge the challenge is, and it doesn't make sense necessarily to me to take options off the table. We ought to be putting options on the table so that governments can do whatever they think is sensible to try to provide better education.
I know a few donors that should listen to the comprehensiveness of your agenda. Desmond, you have the last word of the first round of the panel, and then we're going to turn to our colleagues in the audience.
So let me use that last word by rising a bit to the challenge that you set us as a panel, which is to come up with some new ideas. And I'm going to put forward 2 new ideas that we developed in Save the Children, and then one I'm going to pick up from the Global Monitoring Report and advocate we support it, linked to the right demand from donors and governments for results. I mean, results matter, but we treasure what we measure, and therefore we should be very careful about making sure our measurements are rich and diverse. So what Save the Children has been working on and has now started talking to UNICEF about expanding is the development of a measure that captures some of those things that happen in the classroom that we know are really important, but are hard to measure. The quality of that learning environment. Does the child feel safe? Is the child learning to learn? Is the teacher focusing on the child? Is the teacher punishing the child? Those sort of issues. So we've been piloting across all of our country programs an indicator that aggregates those findings up into a single figure, and that gives us something, therefore, as a result, that we can track improvement on.
And how do you collect that data?
Mostly field visits from our staff or from colleagues or volunteers. We also take input from children and from parents. And as I say, it's similar to a model that UNICEF has been using in Kenya, where they gather that data through mobile phone technology. And that's the conversation we're having at the moment. How can we bring those 2 approaches together? I think that could be a result that matters, and that could really be transformative. The second, not new idea, but taking us back and reminding us of an old idea is, as we've all discussed this morning, literacy and measuring literacy is really critical. But let us not forget that measuring literacy in the right language is absolutely essential. And we are constantly saying that children can't read, but we are not thinking about which language we're asking them to read in. And many of their mother tongues are not literate or written languages. Now, this is an old topic that we need to remind ourselves of, and some of the work that Save the Children's done through our signature program, Literacy Boost, actually takes exactly that approach, with families and communities using their first language and developing learning to read skills that way. And we've found results that show you can achieve improvements in reading 20 or 30% higher through those sorts of interventions than the child who in control schools is not getting those sort of interventions. So that's the second new idea. The third new idea, which I thought I had dreamed up, but actually no, it was in the GMR, so all credit to that, which is, it's been around for a while and people have written academic topics on it, but I really think we should pick it up, which is the idea of an education Gini coefficient. And actually taking the gap, as we do with income, and applying it to learning. And then pushing and pushing and pushing on reducing that gap. And I think, again, if we really got serious, it'd be hard, and it's not easy to conceptualize. Many people, when I Google search this, there's papers in the World Bank back in the 70s and 80s actually first proposing the idea. We need to go back to it, we need to revisit it, and we need to make it work in 1 or 2 countries. Because I think that's how we address the question we've been talking about all day on the gap between the richest and the poorest, not just in terms of inputs, but in terms of learning outcomes. We quantify it, we measure it, and we track it. So it's not a new idea, but it's a great old idea that I'd love to see us revive.
Thank you, Desmond. Well, we now turn to the rest of the participants. I know that after 8 hours today and 5 panels, everybody knows everybody, but still, please introduce yourself, if not for us, for the people who are viewing this through the video. And right here, and we'll take 3 questions, and let's take these 3 questions up here in the front part first.
Hi, Steve Cleese, University of Maryland. I'd like the panel's reaction to 2 points. The panelists and the panelists all day have given us cause for hope. There's lots of people trying to work on important issues. But I'm also pessimistic. I don't see anywhere in these panels where the $26 billion shortfall is going to come from. I haven't heard much about the $26 billion shortfall, and that $26 billion shortfall is an underestimate, all due respect to Manos. It underestimates what's needed to get teacher salaries to quality teachers, and it underestimates what's needed to get everybody in school through conditional cash transfers. My second point is Again, not a new idea. This is a new idea forum, but a lot of old ideas have surfaced here. And it's about tax capacity. It's been mentioned that clearly national sources of revenue are the main source for education. We've spent 30 years basically convincing or forcing developing countries not to raise taxes. It's been part of the conditionalities, and it's been the ideology of developed countries as well, is not to raise taxes. Yet we have huge tax capacity, and probably more than ever before. The inequalities of these 30 years have generated such space for taxation that, to me, that this is the source of the $26 billion shortfall. I'll just end with the quotation that the citation that bothers me the most, that I've seen change over the years. The most recent version of it is that there are 85 multi-billionaires in this world, and if you look up the sum of their total wealth, it's equal to 3/4 of that of the population of the globe. So there's huge tax capacity out there.
Hi, thanks. Rebecca Winthrop. I'm here at the Center for Universal Education. I wanted to make one quick comment based on Desmond putting onto the floor a good old idea about tracking inequality and learning outcomes. And then I also had a question on the conflict humanitarian discussion earlier. So the good news is that the Learning Metrics Task Force, of which a number of the panelists organizations are involved, has put that idea on the table, and it's something they're working on. And there's a bit of a working group to try to figure out how can we really kickstart looking at inequality of learning outcomes within countries. And if people are interested in getting engaged in that, you should definitely approach us or contributing in any way. That would be great. But my question actually was triggered, is maybe directed to Anna, but for everybody. Because Anna, you are new to the education sector in some ways, but you have long time been working in fragile states. And you're very seasoned and experienced in terms of good governance programs and other types of programming. And it was a little depressing when George said, gosh, you guys sound like we were talking about education emergencies 15 years ago. What's possibly changed? And I can think of lots of good things in terms of at a technical practitioner level with education experts who work in the humanitarian field or possibly peacekeeping field. The Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies has lots of great technical tools for practitioners, but it seems that what hasn't changed is actually reaching the people working in peace building or state building, or the people running humanitarian programs who are not education experts. And that seems to be our problem in the education sector, having worked in this particular field in the past. I wish if I had one magic pill, I could give it to every person in charge of humanitarian aid and or peace building, and let them realize that education actually, if you're working on the emergency end of it, what is it going to take, I guess, is my question for humanitarian policymakers to say, well, I guess, we don't necessarily have to prove that education is life-saving. All interventions very quickly after the first couple months in humanitarian sector move to becoming life-sustaining, including lots of health interventions that look at prevention. So why can't we just shift that paradigm? And clearly, if you're looking at life-sustaining, education is central. What is it going to take? Do we need some massive course for all people working in running humanitarian agencies? And similarly for people working in your area, peace building and state building. I mean, the Peace Building Fund, at last I checked, only 14% of it went to education programs, and clearly there's a rationale there. So I'd be really curious, how do we reach those people who are making those decisions?
Thank you. Pamela O'Leary. I'm an adjunct professor at American University. I feel that gender has been largely excluded from today's discussions. And when girls' education is such a successful intervention strategy and a part of the MGGs, I just love to hear some thoughts on girls' education in this conversation, please.
Let me suggest, Alice, that you start the conversation with Steve. And my version of his question to do is, where's Plan B if the 27 billion isn't there? And on his second question, I would say, Steve, you're right on the history of ideology. I've seen a lot of change in that the last 5 years. So I think that's changing. Anna, you'll kick off the response to Rebecca. And on the issue of Pamela's issue on gender, I know I've had conversations with that with Desmond over the years. So we'll ask Desmond to kick that off. And everybody else, if you want to jump in on a particular topic, please do. Alice?
Thank you. I'm trying to figure out how to get at sort of the $26 billion question. First of all, one thing that I think where it's not going to come from is the poor families. So when we talk about various solutions, private sector and so forth, just to get back to a point that I made earlier, I don't think that the solution is all of a sudden to charge huge tuitions to poor families and expect that that's sort of the road forward. So if you look at $26 billion, though, and we should do the math on this, against all of the donor countries and the middle-income countries, the BRICS, that are going to sort of soon become, more and more important in the aid and development world, and you look at that number of 26 billion as a percentage of all of their budget resources, I think you'd find it's a pretty small number. And I also think if you then do additional math about that number against the combined GDP of all of the poor countries, it's also a pretty small number, particularly when you make some assumptions about possibly gaining a better share of natural resource flows and export flows and things like that. So we need to start thinking about education as an investment, not an expense. And we have to begin to understand that and there's lots of reasons why people sort of shy away from investments in education. Results are hard to measure. Results take longer to measure than your typical parliamentary or legislative or budget cycle. 2 years versus, a number of years. So I think what we need to do is a much better job of advocating globally about why people need to pay attention to education. Now, are we going to generate $26 billion overnight? No, we're not. But I think that we need to begin to really change the conversation about, yes, 26 billion is a big number, but not paying attention to it, the cost is going to be infinite. When you think about the importance that education plays. I mean, you all are familiar, I'm sure you've talked about it already, the UN survey that came out, the My World survey that came out, late last week, I believe it was, that said of the 16 factors that people are interested in, education is the top of the list, and number 2 through 15, 16, the rest of them all depend on being able to read, write, and do math. So we have to get at this problem and begin to think about $26 billion not as such an enormous number, but frankly an investment that's absolutely essential. In terms of tax capacity, I mean, we could spend, weeks and weeks talking about the trade-off between higher taxes and impact on growth and job creation. It's a debate that goes on globally, so we won't get into it. I don't think the role of this place is to talk about tax policy. But I do think that we need to think about the $26 billion number in a different way.
So just to build on that last comment, Alice, I mean, I think I'm going to disagree with you on the tax question. I mean, many of you will have heard Trevor Manuel, former Minister of Finance from South Africa, saying he spells aid with 3 letters, T-A-X. And his vision was that all countries in Africa would get to the point where actually they don't need aid anymore, but they were collecting tax revenue in a sustainable way from its own citizens and were using that appropriately to deliver education and health. So I think looking ahead to the next 10 years, Africa countries, a lot of them will move from low income to middle income status. They have had 4 or 5% growth for the past 5 or 6 years. They're doing great, and we should celebrate that. And that will, if we help them generate income through taxation systems and use that revenue appropriately, I think that should be and could be a very significant contribution to filling the financing gap. The second part of the conversation of how the world's changed that we haven't really touched on at all today is the shift of the geo-economic power within the world. I mean, I went on the website for the Uganda Ministry of Education while Daniel was talking this morning. There's a delegation from China there this week talking to them about funding education interventions. They've just signed a deal with India to support scholarships. The Qatari, Sheikh Moza, has announced a massive support to get 10 million more children into school next year. Those bits of the picture are not in this room, and they need to be in our thinking, because this world is a very different world in aid financing and in tax revenue to where it was when many of us started the conversation 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's very right. Good. Thank you, Desmond. Anna?
Yeah, thanks. Rebecca, good question. So, I mean, you know, the humanitarians are obviously all too busy to talk about these kind of issues. You know, they're going out to do life-saving issues. And the governance advisors would be looking at you in horror and saying, of course we thought about this. You know, this is an absolutely fundamental part of the peace-building, state-building approach. But yeah, you're right. You know, it's not a sort of an issue that's been looked at in a huge amount of detail. So, I mean, my immediate response to you would be, okay, so yeah, build systems and build that knowledge within donors, and that's one of the reasons why I have come into the job that I'm doing, is to bring that sort of institutional and approach to what we're doing. So hopefully I can try and do something at least a little bit within DFID on this. But we also, you know, we need to think about that response that we're doing. And it is about supporting some of the immediate needs, but also building systemic change and building capacity. And, you know, in countries we are doing that. You know, I can be sort of slightly flippant about it here, but in countries like Afghanistan, you know, it's absolutely critical that we do meet that immediate need and show some of the gains and demonstrate some of the gains whilst building that systemic change and capacity building. And that's absolutely fundamental. And then, I mean, you know, look at the huge crisis that we have today in Syria. You know, that for me, you know, that is raising the profile for me hugely around education in emergencies. You know, this is something that we really have to focus on. You know, my minister is you know, this is you know, she has made this her calling. And so we need to kind of look at that, see how we can advocate together around some of the issues that are affecting the children in Syria. So that would be my response. Thanks.
Yeah. So, Steve, it was a very good question. 26 billion, do we calculate that right? The truth is we have, in the past, taken into account the cost of reaching the last children, putting some assumptions about that cost. What we haven't done, and it has been discussed today, is that this figure excludes and ignores the amount that families themselves pay. And that, with the National Education Accounts analysis that we are doing this year, can be extremely high, 40 or 50% at some levels in some countries. That needs to be restored. And tax raising is, of course, a very important parameter of that. And the debate whether tax and growth move together or in opposite dimensions or directions, that might be true for the rich countries, but when tax revenue is at the range of 10, 11, 12% of GDP, then clearly that's not, you know, that has to change, that countries need to be helped. And we made some estimates that suggest that with very, very modest increases in tax rates over the next 4 or 5 years, low and middle income countries could raise 26 billion just from very, very small increases, just barely above the current average. On the question of inequalities and how we can measure, just to remind the audience, because I think it's important, some of you may be familiar with the World Inequality Database in Education that the GMR has been presenting over the last 2-3 years. This year, we have incorporated indicators on learning outcomes using regional and international learning assessments. And I invite you all to visit the website of WIDE and also pay attention to the comparison, which is very important. Often we tend to focus on the children who just took the test, who were assessed. What we are trying to do is also see how the results look if we take into account all the children in the cohort, including those who do not make it to the grade where they were assessed. And that generates a wholly different picture. On the conflict question, just to say your question, how can we make people wake up to certain facts? It's not just the conflict people. It's in other sectors too. I mean, if people realized the contribution of education, then the debate would be quite different in many circles. And in this year's report, we have a whole chapter dedicated to a discussion of the effects of education on a wide range of development outcomes. And for those of you who are from different sectors, I hope we're not only talking to each other in the education sector, I invite you to take a look, because you'll find certain very powerful arguments in areas that you might not have expected. For example, issues of conflict tolerance, values, commitment to democracy, etc., that have not been discussed so far. And I think by now we have extremely interesting evidence to share. And not to get the last question unanswered on gender, it's true. It's often the case that because there has been progress, Goal 5 of Education for All has probably achieved the biggest progress in many ways, but that shouldn't fool us to think that we've reached the goal. Not only the issue of equality is different from parity, but even there in parity, sometimes some of the admin data that we look at lead us to think that the problem is solved. That's far from the case. Household survey data show that actually, especially for the poorer girls, there are still very important issues, and that gets exacerbated when we get to look at learning outcomes. So it's far from a finished case. There's a lot more to do.
Desmond, do you want to weigh in very quickly on gender? Very quickly, so we have time for a couple more questions, and we're not late for our 5:15 appointment.
So the one additional point I would make, I thought it was very interesting that the intervention at the UN General Assembly discussion on the post-2015 goals by Argentina on behalf of, I think, 29 countries, focused on two things: sustainable development and gender equity. And a lot of the emerging economies were signing up to those two priorities. My prediction in the post-2015 goals is that those two will figure very prominently, and it's great that they do.
Okay. In the back.
David Archer from ActionAid. I just wanted to pick up on this point around taxation as a key dimension of scaling up financing on education. There's some further data in the Global Monitoring Report this year, which I think is quite startling, that if countries did actually reach an acceptable, a fair rate of GDP to tax ratio and invested 20% of that in education, which is an accepted benchmark, I think the funds raised is something like $153 billion in 67 low-income and middle-income countries. So if we're serious about scaling up financing for education, expanding that tax base and making the case for domestic investments at a fair rate seems to be the best single prospect for making dramatic progress. And I think that one of the interesting, the other, I thought, very revealing statistics in the Global Monitoring Report was research that shows the connection between aid and expanding the tax base. So if you spend $1 of aid on revenue collection capacity in country, you can generate $350 of increased income. Now that $1 to $350, that's a pretty sustainable use of aid, and it may well make a lot of sense for us to use diminishing aid resources to increase domestic capacity if we're going to seriously scale up financing in education.
We have a question way up front.
Thanks. Actually, it's a follow-on on that last point, because those of us who are old enough to remember the origins of the GPE, FTI, remember that the basic rationale, the basic strategy was exactly this mutual accountability pact, that countries would commit to progress on these, towards these evidence-based benchmarks of faster progress, such as expanding your tax base, spending 20% of GDP, 4% of GDP, 20% of your budget on education, 50% of that on basic education, et cetera, trying to get to cost-effective parameters for pupil-teacher ratios and the share of the budget for non-salary expenditures, et cetera. And pari passu with that, the donors would commit to coherent, unearmarked, low transactions costs basket funding of aid. And so someone earlier mentioned, we need to have some results and success stories. What are the examples we point to where that has happened and where there has been faster progress towards universal primary completion, and that this model actually is feasible and working? I haven't heard anyone sort of point to that. And it's struck me in this discussion today that it's been so focused on the really tragic, challenging, impossibly challenging humanitarian cases. And those do present a huge set of issues that I don't think the FTI or GPE was initially set up to focus on and address. And I think it's a real question of how we work together to make sure that those needs are addressed. But there was this whole other segment of the challenge that related where we thought we had a strategy for a mutual accountability pact for making faster progress. And I'd just like to know, has that worked, or does it have to be retooled completely?
I apologize, I can't take any more hands. We have 4 minutes left. And so each of the panelists has 1 minute to respond to the 2 interventions and to make your wrap up for the whole day. You got 1 minute, wrap up the whole day.
No, I don't want to wrap up the whole day. I just want to say that I agree completely. Let's not forget, and I think I mentioned that in an earlier intervention, let's not forget these basic principles of what the FDI was about. Catalyze, then we forgot about it with the catalytic fund, but actually it was catalyze the inputs from all the resources and stop the ebb and flow. Make everything predictable so that countries can plan, because a plan that doesn't have predictable financing cannot work. We can go back to that and achieve that. That's the priority.
I'm surrounded by people who I think know still a lot more about GPE and FDI than I do, so I speak as still a newcomer. I think that the initial focus on system strength is the right one, but not system strength for system strength's purpose. It's to generate certain outcomes. We're now beginning to look at, do we need a sharper set of teeth and a stronger set of levers to incent everybody around the table to actually make investments to strengthen the system, and also to put money in. And that's really at the core of what our new funding model looks like. So I think that the initial premise of you must improve the system is absolutely right. I think that we're perhaps moving the ball ahead a little bit in terms of the how piece of it. So we'll see. I'll get back to you.
I mean, my reflection on the day is that we have begun a process that's really important of changing the conversation. And it is a very different conversation to ones I've previously been a part of, and that's great. I think we need to be even more radical about changing the conversation and the people in the conversation. And I think we need to get to a point where we are delivering what Barbara was referring to, real mutual accountability, and all of us being accountable to the people that we are here to serve, which is the children and their families. And, that's often a rhetorical statement we make. We need to turn that rhetoric into reality, and then it will change the dynamic of the conversation. I was very struck by Claudia's passionate interventions this morning, and I know her 40,000 Twitter followers that you have watch very closely what it's going up every day. Watch very closely what you say to your head teachers each day, and the families watch what's going on between you and your head teachers. That's a dynamic, that's a conversation that we need to make more real, so that we are not feeling safe in these rooms, but we're really accountable to the children and the families that we're supposed to be serving.
Okay, so, just in response to David's question about the taxation issue, I think this is why DFID is investing so much in macroeconomic management. We see this as absolutely essential. We're trying to make our financing transformative, so we really need to make those investments work, and that's why that area is so critical. the second thing on the sort of mutual accountability issue, we have the New Deal for working in fragile states. So, that sets out some really essential principles. We mustn't forget that. That's critical. And then finally, the kind of reflections on the day. This is a huge year for education. We've got GP replenishment happening this year, and we've still got a way to go to convince people about the sort of the education and what about education in general and the sort of put their investment into it. And part of it is about good advocacy, it's about communications. We've got to come together around some of these arguments and really look at what's a simple set of issues that are going to make people sit up and think. We all know about the kind of complex nature of the countries that we're working in and the kind of investments that need to be made, but we need to lift that up to make a really simple set of interventions that are really going to get people to take notice. And that's focusing on some of the positives, around, the economy and how education contributes. This is what's going to make people think and listen and make the investments. Thanks.
Before we thank the panel, under threat of some threat to me, I'm not sure what the consequences would be, but my most important role here is to invite you on behalf of the center to a reception so that you can continue the conversations and connect with old friends and make new friends. So please join us as we move out. And I think 2 thank yous are in order. First to Manos, Alice, Desmond, and Anna for sharing your thoughts and views and knowledge with us today. You've been a sterling panel, and we all thank you very much.